We're moving now into the panel sessions. So if you do have a question and you have a specific person in mind to answer it, could you also indicate that when you write your question out? So just write question for X, and then the question, and then we'll know who to direct the question to. And the person who will be doing all that directing is this man, Peter Marshall, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Monash University, and he's chairing this session on Facing Financial Reality, Achieving Quality. Emphasis on the colon.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be chairing the first of the panel sessions, particularly on with such a stellar panel we've been able to assemble this morning. The three members that will be doing most of the talking, on my far left is Professor Bruce Chapman. Professor Chapman, and Bruce, I did look at your Wikipedia page where it lists you as the father/architect of the HEX system, is of course a Professor of Economics in the Economics program in the Research School of Social Sciences at ANU. He's had an extensive direct policy experience, including the motivation and design of the Higher Education Contribution Scheme in 1988, and as a senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Keating from 1994 to 1996, and a consultant to the OECD, the World Bank and the governments of more than 10 countries, mostly in the area of university financing. On Bruce's right is Mark Warburton. Mark would be well known to many in the audience from his time at Universities Australia and also as a public servant working in the higher education field. He's now an Honorary Senior Fellow at the L.H. Martin Institute, which is part of the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at Melbourne University, and he's worked on higher education funding policy for over a decade in government and at Universities Australia. And on my immediate left is Ittima and Ittima, I'm going to really muck this up, I'm really sorry. Ittima Cherastidtham. Ittima is a fellow at the Grattan Institute. She's co-authored several reports that form a basis of higher education reforms proposed by governments, and this includes the proposal to reduce the repayment threshold of the HELP loan program. Prior to joining the Grattan Institute, she was at the Melbourne Institute. The plan for this morning's session is that each of our speakers will speak for a brief period of time on a particular aspect of the topic we're discussing, and then we're going to rely on you to bring questions to the panel, and we'll engage in a panel discussion with the audience. Our first speaker this morning is Mark Warburton. Mark, I'd like you to present to the group.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank TEXA for inviting me to speak today. Australia can afford a decently funded tertiary education sector to maintain its good economic performance. The basic problem that's been facing the government is that government expenditure has exceeded government revenue, and according to the government, the demand-driven system's been part of this problem. The demand-driven system was a source of cost pressure when it was being introduced, but quite early in the piece, boundaries were put around it, less essential expenditure was cut, and students were required to pay more. This is part of the reason that public investment in tertiary education as a share of GDP is no higher 3 years after the demand-driven system was introduced than it was beforehand. The government has repeatedly told us that over the period 2009 to 2016, growth in Commonwealth Grant Scheme expenditure was double the rate of growth in GDP. But the problem with this fact is that when the government says look at CGS funding, it's diverting attention away from other higher education and vocational funding that's declined. And when it picks 2009 to 2016, it's looking at the only period in the past 2 years when Commonwealth subsidised higher, in the past 2 decades, when Commonwealth subsidised higher education places grew. Significantly, direct government expenditure on higher education research and VET is now trending down in real terms. Over the last 4 years, higher education spending has barely increased by more than inflation. You can hardly see it all on the chart. And vocational education hasn't kept pace with inflation. Real expenditure on the general research function has gone down nearly 66%. The trick to preserving the demand-driven system was always to work out how to ride out the first couple of years and then how to reinforce mature behaviour. Talk about the affordability of the demand-driven systems become an obsession, and recent dialogue about its sustainability has simply clouded the issues that we face. Of course, we want a sustainable tertiary education system, but there's little point in talking about the sustainability of today's lopsided, slightly dishevelled arrangements. We've not agreed fundamental propositions about the nature of a future tertiary education system, and so we've been at an impasse for 5 years. We need a serious and coherent public discourse on how we go forward. To this end, I want to put forward 5 propositions. I'm suggesting that any worthwhile proposal must contribute to the development of a system that satisfies all 5 of them. This is the first. We need to improve public accountability and the effectiveness of regulation. Strong public accountability is the key to managing the moral hazard associated with the demand-driven system. There should be good public information about admissions, attrition, completions, graduate outcomes and so forth. These performance indicators do not need to be explicitly linked to a pot of funding, as indirect links to student place funding are appropriate and adequate. We should expect and demand responsible, mature behaviour from any provider in receipt of public funding. The second problem here is that we know our regulatory systems have failed. Vet fee help exposed confusion about responsibilities and ignorance about how the framework was intended to operate. The response has been a bit unfortunate. It's included increases in upfront financial barriers to study, the removal of student entitlements, and heavy reliance on discretionary decision-making by officials. These are retrograde steps. Getting regulation right isn't easy. Our regulatory system is a complex maze. We need to examine the nature of regulatory failures and identify solutions in light of an understanding of the relationships between the various parts of the system. We need to recognise that the demarcation between higher education and vocational education and training is arbitrary and inessential. In both higher education and VET, the combinations of required competencies and higher order cognition are almost limitless, and they change over time with technological developments. TEXA and ASQA should ensure the quality of the approach that is most suitable in the particular circumstances, and there's no basis for funding arrangements that privilege higher education over the VET sector. We cannot foresee with precision what particular training and knowledge might be necessary to ensure we continue to have a strong economy as the fourth industrial revolution and the Internet of Things wash over us. We're reasonably confident that we will need more tertiary educated citizens and people will have to retrain. Retraining does not mean doing another 3-year higher education degree. We do not know with certainty whether a vocational education provider or a research-intensive institution will be best placed to deliver the technical skills that may be required by a future local business or industry. Our funding arrangements and regulatory systems should not entrench the status quo. They need to be able to deal with new approaches like the Melbourne model, online delivery, micro-credentialing, blockchain facilitation of credit transfer, all the sorts of things that Glyn was talking about this morning. The government needs to clarify that public resourcing of student places, by which I mean the total of subsidies and student contributions, should only be for the reasonable costs of tuition and should not be for research. The benefits of research do not primarily accrue to students, they accrue generally to Australians through their impact on our economy, culture and living standards. There's no policy justification for making domestic students more responsible for Australia's research effort than other taxpayers. This clarification is necessary to achieve equitable funding of student places across higher education and VET. We require detailed study and a decent evidence base to establish both the reasonable costs of tuition and the share of tuition costs to be met by students. We've treated income contingent loans like a magic pudding for financing tertiary education. The answer to the question, how do we know when they're being used inappropriately, is when we start significantly writing down the value of the help asset. In September of this year, the estimated fair value of the help asset as at 30 June 2017 was reduced by $8.4 billion compared to its value in the May budget. There are limits on the extent to which we can use income contingent loans to finance tertiary education, and it's time we started recognising this. The days in which HECS and HELP provided easy extra finance for the sector are over. There need to be limits on people's entitlement to both subsidies and student loans for tertiary education, and government needs to set priorities. Should a retired baby boomer interested in literature be able to study for free, utilising a loan they will not repay, while a disadvantaged young person is required to pay upfront for initial post-school training? There's no hope of any reasonable consensus on the way forward until some of these basic parameters are agreed. My 5 propositions may not be sufficient and they do not deal with Australia's research effort and its funding, but I think if agreed they would provide a reasonable foundation on which our tertiary education system could be further developed. And with that, I will hand over to Bruce.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks very much to TEXA for inviting me. At the risk of undermining Mark's reputation, could I say I agree with pretty much everything he said, with a couple of qualifications. I want to talk to you, this will empty the room, I want to talk about economic theory. But if you do leave, we'll all notice it. And I want to cover 3 topics. One topic I hope doesn't need to be covered anymore, but I want to explain it a little bit, and that's the whole notion of price competition and price discretion that was raised in the 2014 budget. Secondly, I'll address the issue of the use of the HELP or the HECS HELP or PECS income contingent loans for all of tertiary education. I think that's a move that's been overdue for about 29 years or so. And finally, I'll ask the question, if there's going to be government intervention to restrict the extent to which prices are limited, having a loan limit is not the right way to do it. And even if you like economics as I do, and you believe in markets generally as I do, with an income contingent loan, there is an essential problem with allowing institutions to charge, because they will in many cases or eventually charge greater than the loan limit, and then we've got a major problem of access. One of the most extraordinary nights for me in the last 20 odd years was the night of the budget of 2014-15. I was standing in a queue waiting to go into the budget next to my Vice-Chancellor, and I said, by way of very uninteresting small talk, "What do you think will be in the budget tonight?" And he said, "I think that the government will allow the universities to charge whatever they like, and that there'll be a full interest rate on all debt." And I thought to myself, I never thought my Vice-Chancellor had such an extraordinary sense of humour until just now. But then, of course, it occurred to me that he doesn't really have that much of a sense of humour, not about issues to do with university funding policy. So then I thought to myself, quite weirdly, how can I trust this Vice-Chancellor when he's got such weird ideas? But 5 minutes later, Christopher Pyne basically said all that my Vice-Chancellor had said. And it was done in the name of what is called price competition. We like markets because we have efficient clearing mechanisms called prices, and goods can be allocated according to efficient ends. That's the basic model. It is not a model that makes any sense when you've got an income contingent debt. And let me try and explain that. The price that is faced by the student is almost totally unrelated to the price that is received by the institutions. So if a university gets $50,000 for a 3-year degree, that is not $50,000 that a student will have to, or a graduate will have to pay. And you think about this whole notion of price competition. Imagine University A charges $50,000 for a 3-year degree, Institution B charges $40,000. Is that a $10,000 difference? No, it's much closer to zero. And the reason is that what the price faced by the student is the expected present value of the extra years paying back that debt. They never pay any more at any given period. They just pay for longer. You cannot pay more for any given period because the rules are there's a maximum of your income of 8%. What that means is that for someone, say, age 20, they'll be thinking, if I go to institution A at 50,000, I'll be paying for maybe two more extra years, starting when I'm 34 or 35 years old, than going to institution B. When you discount that, and discounting is important, particularly in a context where there's no real interest rate on the debt, ask yourself what is the present value of the 2 years extra payment starting in about 14 years. It sure isn't $10,000. For many people, it'll be close to nothing. And that means that the idea that there'll be important price competition between the institutions in the presence of an income contingent loan is just a very poor understanding of the way these markets work. The other point is the government bears all the risk. You may not like this, and I wish there were ways around this, and possibly there are ways around this, but with an income contingent debt, indeed, any student loan in the world, governments are the ultimate payers in the event of default, or the event of subsidies, or the event with HECS of non-payment, because people have relatively low incomes. What that means is that it doesn't really matter for an institution so long as the price elasticity, that is the responsiveness of students to the price, is very low, and we're very confident that it is very low. All the risk is being covered by the taxpayer. And what that means is it's in the interests of the institutions to charge an awful lot of money, and in my view, this is exactly what would have happened, not straight away, but eventually, when the institutions got used to the system and saw in the data that the price elasticities were extremely small, that would have been the result. It's not just in theory, it's true with respect to the evidence as well. In New Zealand, when they instituted an income contingent loan in 1991, some economists advising them who had just enough economics to be extremely dangerous, in my view, said, markets work, we love markets, let the institutions charge what they like, let a million flowers bloom, we'll all be so happy and the world will be run so brilliantly efficiently. Well, after about 4 to 5 years, the prices had gone up by 300 to 400%. The institutions were rolling in the money thinking, well, this is all pretty nice. What about next year? Another 15%, another 25%. Eventually, a Tory government in New Zealand put a price cap on it and has stayed ever since. Here's some more information. In England, with an income contingent loan that looks pretty much like HECS, the Conservative government allowed the institutions to charge beyond the £3,000 per full-time student year in 2010, up to £9,000 per full-time student year. 98% of the institutions went to the £9,000. Why are they doing this? A, if they don't do it, they don't get as much money as they otherwise would. B, will it have any effect on aggregate demand? No, it doesn't do that at all. And C, maybe it's a quality indicator. Some institutions with poor recent and not very strong research reputations were charging the £9,000 as well. When the equivalent of their Vice-Chancellor were asked the question, how come you did that? Well, it's kind of a dumb question if you think you get all the money, but they often answered because we don't want people to think we're not as good at research as Oxford and Cambridge. This is what economists call a Veblen good. We don't really know what goes on in the institutions. I've been in my institution forever, and I kind of don't know what's going on as an insider. If you're an outsider, a student who doesn't really know anything about institutions, how do you know what it's like? You don't until you experience it. It's kind of like getting married to somebody, which it can be a little unfortunate. In many cases, it can be a complete delight, but it is an experience good. You don't really get it until you do it. For a very long time, many people have been saying, what's special about TAFE, what's special about VET in there not being access to an income contingent loan? The answer is nothing. The market failure that means that banks without government guarantees will not provide resources to people who don't have them to pay for a university tuition is true for all post-compulsory education. It means that in the absence of any loan system, it doesn't have to be an income contingent one, although that's preferable, but without any loan system, people having to find money to finance upfront fees, that will cut out the poor. Cutting out the poor is a really bad idea. It wastes resources. That's the first point. And the second one is it is not consistent with equality of opportunity. So having an income contingent loan across the whole sector is completely important for sound economics and particularly for access. We haven't had that. We haven't even had a loan system of any importance in the VET and TAFE system. One of the reasons, I think, is that the parameters that have been used to collect HECS or HECS help have been relatively high with respect to getting the money back from associate diplomas and diplomas. My colleague Tim Higgins has recently modelled this, and it's fairly clear that you need a lower threshold of repayment, perhaps around $45,000 per year, rather than the current one of over $50,000, to make sure the subsidies are not too big. That can all be done, in my view, without harming access, so long as you cut the rates of repayment from the current 4% of income per year to around 1 or 2. It can all be done, in my view. Tim's modelling suggests that while the subsidies exist, and they're certainly bigger for non-higher education degrees, they can be handled in a way that minimises the cost to the budget. And I think the right way of doing that is with a surcharge. My final point is about loan limits. Loan limits have been imposed in the private sector for Bondi University, for example, and they have been proposed for the VET sector. Loan limits are completely fine if the price never exceeds it. Ask yourself this question: if the price goes above the loan limit, what happens? The same thing that would happen in a world without any loan system at all. People have to find the money, and it's a market that does not work. It is a market because of the lack of collateral that means that relatively poor people, you don't have to come from a poor family, just a family that's not sharing with you. If you have to find the money between the loan limit and the price, we've got major issues of access and equity. It hurts me to say this, but in some sectors with instruments like the HECS system, price competition will not work effectively, and we need price controls, or at least ways of limiting the arbitrariness and the inequities of upfront fees beyond the loan limits. Thank you.
Ittima.
Thank you, Texa, for inviting me to speak here today. So, HELP has been a success. While there are desirable changes to HELP settings, as Bruce and Mark have mentioned, overall, HELP is a great contribution to Australian higher education. From a student's perspective, HELP improve access to higher education, especially to many low SES students. Apart from access, though, students also care about other aspects of their education. First, student experience. Student satisfaction has been stable since the introduction of the National Survey in 2012. Last year, about 4 in every 5 students were satisfied with their education, a similar rate in both universities and other higher education providers. And employers agree. In the latest survey, 4 in every 5 employers were happy with who they hired. The first-year attrition rate fluctuated a little since 2005, but overall the rate is similar for 2015 commencing students as for those who commenced in 2005. About 6 in every 7 students return after their first year. The story is less positive, however, for employment outcomes. Employment outcomes for recent graduates have been deteriorating since 2008. So does it mean we have a quality issue? Not necessarily. With the GFC, we know that market downturns affect younger people more than older people. We also know that the demand-driven produce many more graduates. A combination of many more graduates in a weak labour market is likely to be the main contributor of the deteriorating trend. Having said this, the 2015 survey results suggest that the deteriorating trend is largely stabilising. But even if we don't see a quality problem, that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to improve. But given budget realities, the next phase of improvements will need to be inexpensive. A good example of this is Quilt. Quilt is a website which provides employment outcome and satisfaction information to students. It supports students' ability to make a more informed enrolment decision. And students agree. In 2016, nearly 400,000 people visited the website. That is nearly a 100% increase from the year prior. The government is also committing to better use tax data from the ATO to expand employment information to students. But there's more we can do with Quilt. Quilt should also include attrition and completion data. At the end of the day, to get the employment outcomes available on Quilt, students would need to complete. The data should also be more personalised by taking into account of students' individual characteristics. Providing average information is useful for the average student, but for everyone else is not particularly accurate. Relying on averages is like a student asking for advice from a career advisor who doesn't know anything about her strengths, weaknesses, and interests. To pick up on Mark's point that we need to improve public accountability, I think increasing transparency in the sector will relieve some of the pressures on the regulatory framework. Grattan is working on how to provide more individualised, more personalised information to students. Going to university can be life-changing. It takes hard work to succeed, not just from students, but also their families, friends, and teachers. Providing personalised information is a way we can help students and their support network to make more informed decisions and improving their chances of success.
Thanks. Thank you, Ittima. Hopefully our operators will start to flow some questions to us. And I might ask Bruce to take the first one, which is, could Australia sell the student loan book or part of it to limit some of the exposure like the UK government has done?
Well, it could, but why would you? I mean, for the private sector to take up the debt would cost a lot of money because, first of all, you've got to cover the interest rate subsidy. Secondly, some part of it won't come back. About 15 to 20% in nominal terms doesn't come back because of the low payment. I don't think this should ever be referred to as default. It's just non-payment. No one actually defaults on an income contingent debt. They don't carry the reputation loss as they would by defaulting on US type or Canadian kind of loans. So to sell it would cost a lot. It's got to be in the interests of the institutions to do the private sector to take on the debt. So I don't kind of understand how it limits exposure. It'll just be taken in a different form because the present value of the price will reflect that.
Can I speak on that one? I regard that as one of the crazy ideas that we had to kill off when I was in government, because basically what you're doing is you're taking an income stream of the flow of help repayments, and somebody's walking in and they're giving us a lump of capital and they are buying the income stream. Nobody does that unless they're going to make a profit out of it, which actually means that they will work out what the value of the income stream is. They won't care about what's not being repaid. They're buying the income stream, and they will only give you a lump of capital up front for it if they're going to make a profit. It's crazy for the government to do that. Governments don't do that, just like, they're giving away money.
Good. Now, we might have one, seeing you can keep going, Mark. The next one is for Mark. How can academics supervise PhD students if they are not doing the research themselves? And I think this is in relation to your issue around how how funding should only cover the education cost. There shouldn't be a research component into it.
So I'm absolutely not saying that people teaching in universities shouldn't be academics. I'm not making any statement about what skills different people in universities have. The only thing that I'm asserting is that we need to split funding by function between teaching and research. My view is it'd solve an awful lot of problems. At the moment, we're getting a large quantum of funding effectively diverted away from teaching into research. If you analyse what's growing in terms of university expenditure, university research is increasing at a far greater rate than anything else. Have a look at Frank Larkin's work from LH Martin and CSHE, if you don't believe me. It would be, I just don't believe that students who are being required to pay for their education should be required to put funding into research, because the benefits are generalised and they don't accrue just to them, and they're already paying enough. And I think if you're worried about the quality of teaching, the best thing you can do is to actually get some discipline in universities, so that that they are not drawing resources away from teaching into research. It is $1 million question who decides how much research gets done in Australia. It's a very difficult question. I won't say any more on it at this point. But.
Terrific, thanks, Mark. Another question for Bruce. Mark made the point that help was not a magic pudding, yet there are calls to make the help scheme more available to students of vocational education. Could you comment on I guess, more a statement than a question?
Well, it doesn't have to be a magic pudding to be desirable, right? So, I mean, the only things that are magic puddings are magic puddings. So, this is not the panacea, but let's ask the question, what are the alternatives? You either don't charge tuition, that's extremely regressive, and a really important point in the international context at the moment, in my view. Jeremy Corbett did rather well in the UK general election, partly, I think, because he suggested there could be fee abolition. The New Zealand Prime Minister has announced over time fee abolition, so you could have that. There's probably no more regressive thing you can do in higher education or in any education than to not charge tuition. And the reason is that the people who get the benefit typically come from, not always, but typically and on average come from the advantage side of socioeconomic background, and the private rates of return are extremely high. But you need a system which actually protects people from low financial outcomes in the future, and that's what income contingent loans do. So if you don't want that, and you do want tuition to be charged, the alternative is a bank loan system with government guarantees, which is still the most common form of higher education funding internationally. It's in Canada, Thailand, the United States, for example. Bank loans, or more accurately, time-based repayment loans, do not offer any insurance to people in payment. What that means is what these systems basically do is that they require debtors, graduates, sometimes not graduates, but still debtors, to repay independently of their financial capacity to do so. And that's what happens with those kind of systems. So it may not be the magic pudding, but it is the right way of handling risk. And if it's designed properly, it can be done in a way that the subsidies from government are not that huge. You can actually set the price so that the subsidies to the individual graduates can be relatively low or relatively high, and they're quite different across countries. If the question is, should we not have HECS in vocational education and training, you either say, well, make it free. It's never actually free to the budget, free to the student. That is regressive. Or you have a different bank loan system, which is one without protections.
Thank you, Bruce. Another one for you, Mark. How do your 5 provisions plan to reconcile the disconnect between the need for more robust regulation and the need to foster and drive innovation?
So if your regulatory arrangements are stifling innovation, then there's something wrong with them. I'm trying to argue for getting regulation right, and right regulation doesn't stifle innovation. But we do need to stop things like if attrition is getting excessively high, people don't have decent incomes after they study. All of those sorts of indicators. They don't tell you everything about a university's performance. It's almost impossible to come up with a block of indicators that comprehensively goes to what we might expect from institutions. You can only ever use indicators and judgment, which is one of the reasons why I'm not supportive of Simon Birmingham's proposal to link 7.5% of CGS funding to indicators. He would be buying himself the most enormous argument with the sector. We would wish he never did it if he gets it through. Okay, enough. Yep.
The next question, I think we might get each of the panel members to comment, and that's the one at the top. And the question is, and as I think many would be aware, you can use fee help students can currently use fee help to pay their student amenities fees if they elect to. The question is though, what are the panel's view on expanding the help system to allow students to also fund student accommodation, textbooks, living expenses, etc., to further support them in their education? I might get Ittima to provide a comment first.
Sure. So theoretically, I don't see a problem with using help in other areas, except for one thing, which is the costs involved. So currently, the government doesn't fully reflect the costs in the budget. It's a cost of help. If we want to do that, then we need to have a proper discussion about how we're going to deal with the cost that is going to flow through the budget. And in that sense, maybe we could reduce the threshold to 45, like what Bruce was talking about, so that we can expand this loan scheme even further. But I think the first thing to do is to talk about the cost.
We have been expanding down that direction. Students can now go and get a loan of, $1,000 every 6 months from Centrelink, effectively. That's not a step that I support, primarily because of my views about how Australia's income support system should work. And the other reason I don't support it is that I think, there are limits on how much students should be borrowing. One of the biggest determinants of how much won't be paid back is the amount that students borrow. And we're already loading it up with enough by way of tuition fees. One of the points I've been trying to make about tuition fees is we don't actually have a good handle on the total amount of debt people are leaving the system with when they, for instance, start their first profession. We have arguments about should there be an increase in a student contribution, for 1 year of a course. Well, students are studying 3 to 5 years, then they're doing a master's course as a full fee paying student and adding, 30,000, 50,000 to it. We really need to have, much better information on total debt students have when they pursue their first occupation and who we're getting decent repayments from and who we're not.
And Bruce?
When the system was originally designed, the idea was to take away upfront costs associated with the provision of education. But it didn't do that completely. It covered tuition, but not. There was always a case, in my view, to cover other requirements such as for textbooks, not necessarily for accommodation. We have a means-tested grant system, and I think it works okay. Ittima's point is very important, that once you extend it into other areas or indeed make it higher, you can't ignore the budgetary implications, and they take the following form. It's not the outlays that matter. They matter in the short term, and they matter for the optics. It's the interest rate subsidies. So I would think that if you're going to do that, and in theory I agree with my colleagues that there is a case for using it for some part, there would need to be a surcharge on top of it, just to keep the Department of Finance a little bit on the quiet side about it all.
Thank you. Again, Bruce, I think you're up next as well. You've been asked, ATAR is a great determinant of access and is more closely linked to income of family. Fixing ATAR links to SES is more important than fixing prices of degrees. Discuss.
All right. Well, they can both be important. I mean, I'll refer you to the work of Bully Kardak and Chris Ryan about access. The real reason they believe, and this is very rigorous econometric work, that people from high income backgrounds are more likely to go to university than people from low income backgrounds, is what's going on with the ATAR scores. So it's really important in understanding access that what is happening when people are a lot younger than at the end of high school is completely critical. With that said, there's some things governments are very ill-equipped to do. A lot of this activity and a lot of these forces are going on within a family home, within the family neighbourhood, within the vision of the location and the perspective of relatives. These issues are completely important to access. So that's a critical point about how we think about equity and access. Having universities responsible for getting relatively poor people into the system is a pretty big ask, in my view, because much of the action's gone on well before that. So Chris Ryan and I looked at data. It has to be panel data because people are so different. Many of the things that we care about with access to education, you can't measure very well. So panel data allows you to control for the individuals. 12-year-olds were asked the question, do you intend on going to university? Even if they kind of answered, well, they did answer, but even if they weren't quite sure what a university meant, when we followed the same people, not us, but the longitudinal data series did, followed them to the same people at age 20, something like 90% of the ones who said yes at age 12 were in the system. And something like 5% of the ones who said no were in the system. That is, even by age 12, these things are pretty set and pretty important. So it does matter. I wouldn't be fixing the ATAR to the income and access. It's already happening implicitly. But we also know that whilst the idea that there should not be some control over prices is just a misunderstanding of how these systems work. If there's no price control in these worlds, then the prices will be hugely different from the marginal costs of provision, and that's an unreasonable instrument to give to the private sector, in my view.
Sure, Ittima.
So to pick up on Bruce's point about making the two systems more equitable, I think if we want people to go to university, we also need to make sure that the access, the opportunity, the options available between the two different sectors are essentially equal. So the funding to VOC-Ed needs to be more equitable in a way that, compared to higher ed, so that students don't actually have to pay up front for something.
Look, there are a lot more questions. Clearly, Mark, your statement about only funding education and not having a component for research is a hot topic amongst our audience, but regrettably we've run out of time. I'd like to just join me in thanking Mark, Bruce and Ittima for their presentations and input.
Just before the panel leaves the stage, do we have any students in the audience? Yes. I would wonder if any of you want to come up to the mic and just talk a little bit about the fiscal realities of being a student. Too risky? Because I'm conscious that your voice wasn't actually in the debate. Yeah? No? Anyone want to have a go? There's a microphone down here. Yes, please, come down. Just in the interests of inclusion. It's a long walk to the front. While this happens, I'm going to thank Peter for being a great marshal. See what I did there? High five. Thank you so much for coming up to the microphone. And please introduce yourself as well. There's a mic right there.
Here?
Yeah.
Hi, Sophie Johnston, President of the National Union of Students. Now, I didn't prepare anything earlier. I think when we're talking about the financial sustainability of the sector, I fear that there's a bit of a lack of vision. We're kind of stuck in this kind of HECS-centric idea where you get a degree, you rack up a $30,000 debt, and then you end up earning more, and you can pay that back over the course of your lifetime. My worry is that we're not really talking about what's going to be happening in the next 10 to 15 years, where automation and artificial intelligence are going to change the way that we work, the way that we study, the way that we live, the way that we interact as a community. I think that these ideas of lifelong learning, developing both social and communicative skills being incredibly important to being able to adapt in a changing workforce. I think that we're not talking enough about how we're doing that and how we're providing that kind of education. In the UK, they're talking about degree apprenticeships and incorporating the way that industry and education work together, but I don't think that we're doing that enough in Australia. I don't think that we talk about lifelong learning enough. The fact that today's graduates, they're not going to just leave universities and never go back. They're going to be interacting with higher education multiple times throughout their lifetime. And is the system currently sustainable to work with that? Can individuals be racking up $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 every time that they need to be reskilled or retrained in an adapting workforce? So I think that those kind of questions don't come up enough when we're talking about the financial sustainability. I think we're very much in looking at the past 10 or 20 years in this HECS system. I think what we really need to do is create a vision for what we want the next 10, 20, 30 years to be looking like.
Thank you. Thanks, panel. You're dismissed.